just recently on the stage, you have been talking about culture, and in particular, culture at Netflix. So can you describe that for us?
Yeah, I think that a lot has already been said about Netflix culture in general. And what you very often see is that a lot of people tend to focus on one or two elements from that entire culture deck. And what many people fail to see is that it is really an interwoven system of different cultural philosophies that support and strengthen each other. So instead of being standalone items, they're actually one part of an interwoven system of culture.
Mm-hmm. You've showed quite a lot of material and components of the culture, and it looks really complex and just interwoven, as you say. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What was one component, or just a couple of components, which spoke to you most? Were your favorite?
Yeah. There's a few. I think that one that really spoke very, very highly to me is the concept of farming for dissent. And that is, we've all been in situations where you need to take a lot of decisions under pressure, where you have very little time, limited information, and you still need to get a certain decision over time. And we never really take the time to actually do that farming for dissent and listening to what are the opposing voices out there against the idea that I'm having. So the concept of farming for dissent means that you're actually going around stakeholders and asking them why this idea of yours is the most ridiculous one you've ever had. And that kind of works on two sides. That on the one side, you let stakeholders speak up about a potential solution that you're going to implement. And that already means that a lot of people will create more engagement with the proposed solution because they have the opportunity to speak up. And at the same time, it's a very good sanity check for yourself to see if you actually missed out on a critical piece in your suggested solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, listening to you on stage, I was thinking, because Netflix is quite a large company, organization with so many, just locations, people, structures. How do you actually ensure that all the components are ensured and taken care of?
With culture, there's always variance. So there is no one company culture. Yes, there is the same culture deck, but what certain words mean in a certain company or even in a certain team or a certain country can still be different. And it's the same as with any type of culture, with any national culture. Yes, you can speak about some cultural elements that are deeply ingrained with everyone, but there's always going to be variance. Whether it's a local accent or whether it's a local custom, there's always going to be nuances that are there and that should be there, but that still are contributing to that one big overall cultural concept.
Mm-hmm. But how is the message passed? I mean, technically, how do you onboard new people onto the, what is expected culture-wise, and how do you, just split the responsibility?
Yeah. Well, it starts with the selection at the gate, right? So being really critical about who it is that you're bringing on and really investing a lot of time in figuring out whether there is a cultural fit. Because it does require a certain mindset, apart from the technical capabilities that a candidate may have. And it's crucial in those interviewing processes to actually get a sense of whether this is going to work in the longer term. The more effort you put in that in the selection process, the easier it becomes when people are on board. And then by the time that people are on board, it is really as simple as leading by example. Everyone will look up to their leader as a role model, no matter where you are. And the same is happening at Netflix. And that goes all the way to the top of the organization. So as long as you make sure that you start there at the top, role model it there, roll that out through all the layers of management, that means that throughout the company you get a sense of what that culture really means. It's being felt. Mm-hmm. And people start acting like it because people tend to copy the behavior that they see done from others.
Sure. Yeah. So how is the Netflix recruitment process different, and how do you check those things that you mentioned?
Well, to begin with, 8 to 10 interviews is not an uncommon thing. And for many organizations, that is already a hike, right? Because in our existing drive to simply bring in talent as quickly as possible in a short period of time as possible, we often are happy if we can fill a vacancy instead of actually taking the time to see whether there's a good cultural match. And having those set interviews with a lot of different stakeholders gives you, again, a lot of different perspectives about, is this going to be a cultural fit to the company? So in that sense, having a candidate go through interview panels is already a stage of farming for dissent. Is this person really going to uphold those same cultural norms, same philosophies, same things that we expect people to have there?
Mm-hmm. Would you have any particular examples which remind you of Netflix culture in real life?
Well, the high levels of transparency is a very concrete one. Areas where indeed high-level strategic documents asked or were at least still shared with a relatively large part of the company for open feedback, where people can actively give comments about what is being happened there. It's very much a company that invites for discussion. And you see that in all those elements coming back.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about any situations when you've seen or you've foreseen that, just the situations will compromise the culture that is needs to be built or which is attempted to build, like any compromises that you make on the way?
It's an interesting notion that you would compromise on culture, because it kind of implies that culture is a fixed state. Mm-hmm. Culture is always an evolution. Culture is always changing. The Netflix culture from today is not the same as it was a year ago, as it was 15 years ago. So the most important thing about any type of culture, whether it's a national or a company culture, is not so much to worship the ashes that once were, but to keep the fire burning.
Yeah.
And to put new logs on the fire to actually make sure that it continues its journey moving forward. And that means that even dissenting voices are a part of culture. And I'm sure that in any country and in any company, we always have voices that say that it was always better in the past, that whatever happens, things were better in the past. But at the end of the day, that's very often also just a romanticized view of what the world was back then. At the end of the day, it's not about what happened before, it's about how we make sure that what we think is important continues to happen moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Chris, you also questioned this. Is it possible to copy Netflix culture, and can you actually copy it? Yeah, and it was quite obvious from your presentations that the system is so interwoven, and there are so many important components that you can't really take something and become the same thing.
I think one notion that is very important is not to look so much at what other companies are doing, like Netflix, even though that's an example to many, but look at what needs happening in your own company, what makes sense for your organization. And I think that is a very strong philosophy from Netflix as well, where you don't get carried away by what others are doing. Focus on what you're doing yourself and look at how you can influence that. And as we've seen, there's very often in your own history, whether it's personal or your company history, there are already these building blocks of that have brought you to where you are today. And if you can simply start building onto that, you're starting to create your own interwoven system. And you don't need to look at a different company, maybe as inspiration, but not as an example to copy. You need to build up your own system.
You're now consulting companies on organizational cultures, correct?
Correct.
So can you tell me, can you share maybe, just what kind of questions usually companies have that they come to you with?
There's a number of questions. One is with a lot of companies that are growing in the maturity stage, where they need to make a shift from revenue generation to profitability, where it's no longer simply about bringing in business, but it's actually turning a profitable organization. And even though that's very often considered a numbers exercise, it is very much a mental mind shift that people in the organization need to do. Another area where we see a lot of questions coming is companies that went through a lot of different M&As, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and are coming to that question of, okay, now who on earth are we? now that we are this combination of all these different type of companies, how do we find our own identity in this palette of acquired companies? And last but not least, there's companies that are looking at the downturn and are also understanding that even though they may need to let go of people today, they will probably need to hire the similar type of skill sets as soon as the economy turns in just a year from now. So then it's really about how do you make sure that letting people go is an as good as possible experience so that you control the narrative and make sure that people actually, when the economy goes better, are interested to rejoining you.
Mm-hmm. So let's say we have an example of company who has gone through merger and acquisition, just the merger process. So what's the typical way for you to work with such, a situation and how to work on culture?
Yeah. What you generally see happening with mergers and acquisitions is the use of two different types of models. One is a dominance model, in which basically the acquiring company comes in and changes the logos, changes the hoodies, make sure that from one day to the other, everyone is changing to the same systems and procedures, and you're basically being made one of the mother company.
Okay.
The other model is more a tolerance model where we kind of leave things the way they are. We kind of expect the company to just continue working as always. And over time, bit by bit, we make some adjustments. What both models completely deny is the very essential questions that the two companies that are going together are essentially different. So it is not so much about dominance or tolerance. It is about how can we find out at a very early stage where you and I are different, and how can we make sure that we address those things at a very early on stage so that we get the best out of the acquisition.
Yeah. How is it done?
Interestingly enough, it very often starts with talking and listening. So when you come into a new organization, instead of starting to change everything that's going on, understand why the things are the way they are. Take the first couple of weeks to just listen to the stories of the people that built up the organization that made it worth for you to acquire in the first place. And probably you will find a couple of nuggets in there that you want to leverage on, that you want to export to the wider organization. But you can only do that after you've had that intensive listening to begin with. When that is done, you actually start with probably the best way of getting this integration going is having a lot of proximity, meaning letting people experience what the two different companies are like. Putting people on an airplane, simply spend time with each other. The best thing in any cultural integration is to spend time with each other. Mm-hmm. Because the least time you spend with each other, the easier it is to think that the other person is different, culturally, in any type of ways. The more you're exposed to each other, the more you start to see the similarities.
Correct. What's the role of management here?
Leading by example. And it starts at the top, right? It starts with the CEO already having the understanding of, hey, I've hired an organization full of brilliant people. I've only done that because they can do something that I can't or I won't want to do. And when I start acquiring other companies, this is not just me expanding my empire. It's not about you. It's not about ego. It's about how do you make sure that you build up an organization that absorbs the best of any of the acquired companies and grows being successful in the future. Also with acquisitions, let's face it, sometimes it takes years to reach a certain level of assimilation.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Coming back to cultures in general, Chris, do you see any tendencies in cultures prevailing across organizations? Just some trends or some even something fashionable popping up, or it's like you say, it's unique and it's from company to company.
Well, the one big revolution that every organization has faced in the last couple of years is, of course, the pandemic, where from one day to the other, millions of people had to work from home all of a sudden. If you look at the agility and speed in which we as companies, but also as humankind, have been able to adapt to that model, it's fascinating. companies would never have come to any work from home policy in this extent unless there was such a big, impactful event as this one. And now coming out of that, a lot of companies are still facing that question of, okay, so who are we now? Because one thing that the pandemic has proven is that we can work remotely. It doesn't really matter where you are or what you do. You know, the fanciness of your office is no longer a big selling point. So what is it then that you can offer? And that is an area where things like the meaning of the work that you're doing, the sense of community, the sense of commonality with your colleagues starts to prevail. Mm-hmm. And that means that there's a lot of emphasis on, you know, how do we use office spaces? What do we use office spaces for? How do we create an environment where people can have flexibility, but also still be at the most productive? And with that, the overall question of what can you as a team do to add the most value to your organization?
As difficult and painful as it, just may sound, but usually we were talking, typically about onboarding, right? So basically we have our culture, our processes, and we onboard new people. But after such large changes which we've gone through, it's actually, we need to revisit every process and everything that we've done and how much it changed and how much, we reshaped maybe consciously or unconsciously things, and then reboard the whole organization back again. Because, we are now in a hybrid world, and some things that are changed in one part of organization may not reach the other, and, just all those tricky things.
And that is exactly why this is such a brilliant time to be working in HR, because you really get to revisit everything, question everything that we thought was normal for at least 20, 30 years.
Jūs klausite podcasto Žmogiškieji Iššūkiai. Kad nepraleistumėte naujų epizodų, kviečiame prenumeruoti laidos naujienlaiškį adresu žmogiškieji.lt. Podcastą prenumeruoti taip pat galite per Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher ir kitose platformose. Laidos partneris Audioteka verslui. Nuolatinio tobulėjimo kultūra jūsų organizacijoje. www.audiotekaverslui.lt